We're back, and let's talk about the next area of population, that's age. Now, age by itself is a biological factor. Either you're 6, or you're 7, or you're 8. But what meanings do we attach to that? And so let's talk about kids. Today, in this country, once you are 16, that's when you can probably first find a job. But you really can't do much before that. So most of you did not grow up working in factories. But as recently as the 1930s, a large number of children under the age of 12, in fact as young as 7 or 8, worked in factories or shops for money. It wasn't just working for someone's dad or their uncle. We saw children basically up until the 1930s. The idea that a child should not have to work till they were 18 was just foreign. As soon as a kid could walk, they were helping on the farm, working, helping earn money for the family. But in the 1930s, it's interesting. We didn't stop this practice in the United States because, oh, it's so bad and kids need to go to school. But we think today that they should be getting their education and not, using that time to work. But instead, the idea was in the 1930s, we had an economic downturn so severe, so many people were out of work, that the government thought if we made it illegal for children to work, that would mean they'd have to hire more adults. And that's actually the start of the labor laws. What about this idea of independence? When are you supposed to be living on your own as a functional adult, paying your own bills? And it isn't that long ago that the basic idea was once you finished high school, that you would be out on your own. That if you went to college, you'd do it on your own. But today, the very fact that I'm talking to about 30 of you who are probably in fact, I know you're all over the age of 18, right? In different ages. But many of you are still, for the most part, students. You may be working part-time or full-time, but you're not living on your own. Maybe you're staying with your parents or you have roommates. So this idea, it's really kind of morphed. We've kind of come to understand that, it isn't so much 18, you're an adult, you are legally, but there's still school to be had until you're older. And so that kind of ties into the last one. At what age do women have their first child? So in this country, it's not illegal for someone to be married at age 16 in some states, but it's pretty rare. The average age of an American woman at the birth of her first child is 26. And compare that to other countries, like some parts of Africa, the average age is 14. And that's viewed as acceptable. But if you go back even 25, 30 years ago in this country, the average age was 21. So it's changed in this country. It has varied. And that might be part and part goes in hand with this idea that, right, instead of getting out of high school at age 18, getting married, having kids, now people are going to college and working and delaying that. Many of you in this class, I'm pretty sure, have decided, either consciously or not, to delay a family because you know that makes going to school very difficult, right? So age, what it is to be that changes. And the last one, well, not the last one, but we're going to focus on is race and ethnicity, right? And so I cannot stress this enough, that race and ethnicity are social constructs. They are social, they are economic, they are political, they are not biological. There is no gene that makes someone Latino or black or Asian, okay? We can't find that. When they talk about looking at someone's genes, and they can say that maybe this person was this or that, what they're looking at is this. In any given population of people, right, no matter where they live, they tend to have similar genetic structures. And so when we look at people's genes, and we can see that they are similar to other people, it doesn't tell us if they're Asian or Chinese or German or whatever. It tells us that this population of this person probably is part of this population. And then we can talk to the people and say, oh, where do you live? And we say, oh, you live in Germany. Well, then we know. But it isn't because they live in Germany they have that gene, if that makes sense, right? We define races. Races are identified usually in relation to other races. You're black, you're not Asian, you're black. You're not Hispanic, you're French. Or you're not Asian, you are Asian. Racialized groups are a social construct, and in large part, it's how we actually classify and control society. So what I've got up here for you to read, this is the actual instructions for the 1930 census takers. So every 10 years, the government goes out and does a survey of who lives in this country. It takes basically count people who are here. And then we were marking things like their ethnicity, their race, right? So here's the instructions. If someone is sex, write M for male, F for female. Next column. Color or race, write W for white, NEG for Negro, Mex for Mexican, N for Indian, C for Chinese, J for Japanese, so on. For any person of any other race, write the race in full. Okay, so far. Here's the next one. Negroes. A person of mixed white and Negro blood should be returned or listed as a Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. So in other words, if your great-great-grandfather was black, then you're black, no matter what, right? A person of mixed Indian and Negro blood should be returned to Negro unless there's more Indian blood. So something happens. I guess Indian blood has different genetics at this point, and if you are 51% Indian, then you're no longer Negro. And if you're not understanding that, that's sarcasm. Let's go on further. Indians. A person of white and Indian blood should be returned as Indian, except where the percentage of Indian blood is very small. Just a little bit of Indian. No, then they're white. So think about that, right? If you're black, you're black. No matter what, no matter how little, you're black. But if you're Indian, well, he's kind of white. Right? So that just shows you that this is not hard and fast science, right? I'm not even going to get into the idea of full-blooded versus whatever. And this has changed. This has definitely changed. But why would that be? You have to realize that in this country, we have this history with African Americans in this country. And there was for many years, this notion or this law of the one-drop rule. And that is if you had one drop of African American blood anywhere in your family line, you were black. And the sad part is a lot of that was because a lot of slave owners raped their female slaves, which isn't legally rape when you own someone. It's still rape. But now here's the issue. Now they have children who are half white and half black. How do you say they're still a slave? Well, the law states one drop of black blood makes you a slave. Makes you black, which makes you a slave, right? So there's some very problematic issues here, right? Define that. So ethnicity refers to many different collective views. So here's the example. Are Haitians Hispanic? So if you don't know about this, Hispanic, right? First of all, ask yourself, what does it mean to be Hispanic? What makes somebody Hispanic? Do they have to speak Spanish? Okay, well maybe. Do they have to have a dark or light skin color? Does that matter? Do they have to come from a certain country? What does it mean to be Hispanic? So generally speaking, it tends to be we look at people who come from maybe Mexico or Central America, right? Maybe South America, maybe not. That's kind of a thing. But usually you hear Spanish tossed in there. But what about people from Brazil? They don't speak Spanish. They speak Portuguese, right? But here's the idea. Hispanic, which the term now is even kind of being fallen out of favor. Now you hear terms like Latino or Latinx. 35, 40 years ago, you didn't hear anything. You heard it was Chicano was the term. So the terms have even changed over the times. But Hispanic refers to this. There's an island in the Caribbean called Hispaniola. One half of the island is Haiti. The other half is the island of the Dominican Republic. Both halves of the island have different colonial identities. One was a French colony. One was a Spanish colony. But the people are basically all descended from African slaves that were brought there. So genetically, they're almost exactly the same. They're both based on African slave populations that were brought over here during the slave trade. But the people in Haiti identify as black. That is what they identify as, black or Haitian, and they speak French. The people who are in the Dominican Republic identify as Hispanic or Latino and speak Spanish. If you guys know who Sammy Sosa was, he was a baseball player for the Cubs in the 1990s. Kind of famous for hitting home runs and taking steroids, but he was from the Dominican Republic, and he said, I never knew I was black until I came to the United States, because he was immediately identified by people here as black. He's like, no, I'm Latino. And that's the idea of imposed identity, or imposed ethnicity. The people that today we call African American in this country, or black, come from many different parts of Africa. It wasn't one part, it's a whole continent. But when they came here, they were called slaves, or other words that I'm not going to use in this class. And their identity, their ethnicity, right, which we have now come to call African American or black, that was kind of imposed. Over time, it was, well, not over time, it was imposed, and it basically over time overwashed a lot of their actual ethnical groups back in Africa, whether they were from the area of Nigeria or Angola, all those different things. Many times, people choose to identify that way. And so some people choose to identify as Latino, and some people don't. There are people that are, have a Latino sounding last name, like say Gomez or Sanchez, but their families have been here for so long that they don't even speak any Spanish. And some people choose to identify as Latino and some do not. And that's another part of this whole thing, is that ethnicity can also be, in many ways, self-defined or adapted. Okay? We also see a lot of racial or ethnic clustering, or that's the nice word. We can also call it segregation or separation, right? Chinatown, or the West Side, or a little village. Now, it can often start in a positive way, a support system. So Chinatown actually has that function. The neighborhood that is Chinatown, one of the things that has kept it so Chinese, if you will, is that as immigrants have continued to come from from Asia to here, having a neighborhood where people speak the language that you spoke growing up, the stores that sell the food and the products that you're used to, that helps you, kind of gives you a base to let you adopt. It also allowed immigrants to bond together to help loan money to other immigrants to build new businesses and homes. And so it's kind of this support system, okay? Now, one of the things we do notice when it comes to these things is how separate is this? So how Chinese is Chinatown, right? How Mexican is Little Village, you could say. And what we find is that the difference, or the degree of difference between the group and the population, is reflected in the clustering. If a group of immigrants is very different culturally from the surrounding culture, then their ethnic neighborhood is extremely clustered, very tightly, like Chinatown. You think of the Chinese immigrants coming to the United States in the 1880s and the 1890s to the West Coast, right? They were not Christian and they were not Western, and most of the United States was. And so it was a very big difference. And so the Chinatowns of Los Angeles and Seattle and San Francisco were extremely separated in a lot of ways. But it isn't may, it usually is also discrimination. One of the reasons why you see neighborhoods in Chicago that are largely African American is patterns of discrimination. Up until the 1960s in Chicago and many other cities, it was perfectly legal to not rent an apartment to somebody because they were black and you didn't want to, or not sell a home to somebody because they were Mexican. That was legal. In fact, the only area of the city that allowed African Americans to live there was this area right along basically what is Martin Luther King Boulevard and State Street. Very narrow area called the Black Belt, which is now Bronzeville. And so this basically legal discrimination, segregation, clustered African Americans into these neighborhoods. Okay? So these ethnic groups, these neighborhoods, are created by people and they're maintained by power. The African American neighborhoods of Chicago were created as a place for African Americans to live because they wanted people to come here who were African American to work in the factories. They paid them less, but they still wanted them here, right? But they maintained that by power. They had laws. You could not live there. And if you found somebody who was willing to sell their house to somebody who was black in that neighborhood and the black family moved in, then they faced the risks of people driving by at night and throwing bricks or dynamite in their house or breaking down their windows. So these acts of power maintain that. What's interesting is these are, like all social constructs, can evolve. Chinatown in Vancouver, in Canada, begins as a segregated community in the 1920s. The Chinese had to live there. There was nowhere else they could live. But what's interesting, over time, it changed. And by the 1990s, as the prejudice had kind of lessened, and the Chinese immigrants that were coming were extremely rich, in 1999, right, in 1990, the Communist government of China takes over Hong Kong, and a lot of wealthy Chinese leave Hong Kong and move to Canada. All of a sudden now, Chinatown in Canada is a very desirable, expensive neighborhood. They evolve. This all is part of what we call maybe the melting pot. I don't know about you, but I was told in school that America is a melting pot. All these people come from around the world, and they all join together, and we all kind of melt into one American ethnicity group. Um, I think the better term that we actually result is polyculturalism. That yes, we've all come to this country with different groups. There have been some assimilation, but there's been a lot of identity is still maintained. Groups still keep their identities. They interact with each other. So I think the great example of this is Taco Bell. Because Taco Bell is not really American food, but it's not really Mexican food. It may be Texan food. It's this kind of mixing of the different groups, right? So I'm going to pause right here for station identification. We'll be back in just a moment.